Hello and welcome to Cinema Spotlight with Jake and Reuben. He's Reuben.
He's Jake, and this is our regular roundup of all of the films and re-releases hitting screens this week. First up, we are going to be talking about the Bob Dylan biopic, A Complete Unknown, starring an Oscar-tipped Timothée Chalamet.
Then we're moving to the deep, dark woods of Oregon to watch Leigh Whannell's reimagining of the Universal monster movie classic, The Wolfman.
And is that the William Tell overture I hear? No, because it's not in this film, which is, of course, Claes new action epic, William Tell.
And we'll be having a brief discussion about the master himself, David Lynch, who passed away last week.
Do make sure that you are following us on YouTube. You can like, subscribe, and comment on all of our videos. Keep up with the latest episodes and tell us what we've got wrong. And we're also available on Spotify so that your ears can enjoy the Cinema Spotlight goodness wherever you go.
And a call out to all up-and-coming filmmakers out there. We'd love to watch your films and get you in on the show for an interview, so please contact us at cinemaspotlight, Jake and Reuben at gmail.com. Our first film we're talking about this week is A Complete Unknown, the Bob Dylan biopic by James Mangold. A look at two key moments in Dylan's early creative life, his birth as an artist with his very opening albums and his emergence onto the scene, and then later in his life at his first real reinvention, Going Electric, which is the book that this film is closely based on. Obviously, this film stars very famous people. Timothée Chalamet, Ed Norton take very leading roles of established real-life people, Bob Dylan and Pete Seeger, respectively, but also for more up-and-coming actors like Monica Barbaro, who plays Joan Baez, and of course, Elle Fanning makes an appearance as well. This film is tipped for Oscars, as most of these biopics often do. And I must say, I think relatively unfairly, not that the film was bad in any way, but does it deserve the upper echelon of Hollywood recognition? I'm not sure, but instead, I'm going to ask my esteemed colleague what he thought. So, Reuben, what did you think of this film before I start doing my terrible Bob Dylan impression all the way through this?
Well, I'd sort of like to hear your Bob Dylan impression and see if it's worse than Timothée Chalamet's, because I think to get right to the heart of what I felt about this film, I didn't believe that he was Bob Dylan. I felt like I was watching a tribute act, and to be honest, a bit of an annoying one. I found the pose, the stylings, the voice very, very affected. It didn't feel authentic to me, and I don't think that he should win Best Actor at the Oscars. I know he's currently the second favourite at the bookies. I just don't think that it's a particularly good performance. I don't think that's necessarily Timothée Chalamet's fault, because I think the script actually gives him very little to work with. James Mangold has talked about the fact that, this is basically about the period of Bob Dylan's life where he was in the folk music scene and he was kind of a folk musician, and basically exploits that scene in order to become a big deal. And that extends to the relationships he has with, for example, Ed Norton's character and with Monica Barbaro's character also. So I found it kind of a hollow watching experience, honestly. I liked the music. I was tapping my toe along. I think, the rendition of those songs is broadly good. I think that in song, Timothée Chalamet gets away with the voice a little bit more because I don't expect it to sound like Bob Dylan. I like the fact that they didn't blend vocals. They went with a lot of live recorded on-set performances that he did. And every single song that you hear in this film, it is Timothée Chalamet alone singing. And the credits make that very clear. They say all vocal performances by Timothée Chalamet. But I just didn't care about his character. I think it's an interesting take, I suppose, to basically frame the hero of your story as a bit of a conniving, selfish guy. I just watched the film and thought, yeah, you're right. He's using Elle Fanning. He's using Ed Norton. He's using the folk music scene. He thinks he's really, really cool. Everything is incredibly easy for him because everybody looks at him for 5 seconds and recognizes he's a genius. And then he has a great reinvention of himself after a slightly turbulent set. I mean, I didn't think this was a particularly interesting story, honestly. I think you could have framed it in a more dynamic way with a bit more acknowledgement of the fact that Bob Dylan is frankly very unlikable for the entirety of this film and learns nothing. There's no arc to his character, in my opinion. But they've I think gone with a really, really kind of conventional and quite unimaginative, quite unexplorative take on this character, and I didn't love it. I mean, it's really, really well made. James Mangold is a brilliant, brilliant filmmaker. He's got a great back catalogue as James Mangold, and this completely, I think, continues him, showing that he's a filmmaker who can make anything look really good, sound really good, be interestingly shot. I'm not criticizing any of the kind of technical elements of this. I just think that this isn't a very interesting story. It's all about the silhouette at the end. We don't learn anything about Bob Dylan. We just learn, wow, he's a genius, and that's what he looks like.
I completely agree. I find Timothée Chalamet's impression, I wouldn't say it's a performance. I didn't believe for once that he was Bob Dylan, like you said. I think the voice is, in a way, it is like an SNL portrayal of Bob Dylan. I think it's the worst when he's trying to do the Bob Dylan aphorisms, when he says these slightly mysterious, poetic things, especially when he first talks about Joan Baez. I thought she was pretty, but the blue eyes, I didn't like that. It's very much, it's that. It's terrible. And with the singing, I think, Bob Dylan's an interesting artist to do, because you don't have to be a great singer to imitate the Dylan voice, because Bob Dylan famously is a wordsmith and a poet, and a lot of people would not put him as a singer first. But I think they may have lent into that aspect too carelessly, because when you listen to early Dylan, there's a warmth to his voice, like a genuine warmth, and it sounds like his voice when he sings. And I know that sounds like a rather stupid thing to say, but it is owned by him. Whereas Timothée Chalamet seems very, very strained when he's singing, very strained. And I find that that isn't a reflection. Yes, okay, Bob Dylan's strange, but much later in his career, he actually got a bit more sonorous in the early years. I'm a big Bob Dylan fan, as most aspiring musicians often are. I found it relatively disappointing. It was like posturing, as you said. And I found that there were much greater performances, both vocally and as a character. In Monica Barbaro as Joan Baez was my absolute favorite. I thought she sounded sonically like an angel. To me, should have been in the film 10 times more. And forgive me, I'm forgetting the actor's name, a frequent Mangold collaborator, but the Johnny Cash was maybe even better than Joaquin Phoenix's in the presentation. It was absolutely wonderful. Not only looks like Johnny Cash, but also sounds and the mannerisms are much better. Boyd Holbrook, I'm being told by my earpiece. Again, another key player. Ed Norton, I thought, was very good as Pete Seeger. I thought he provided a warmth that often I don't feel you can attribute to Ed Norton. He often plays slightly more grey area characters. However, Pete Seeger is very much an American icon and warm soul. And I thought it was actually a really nice change of pace for him, because he was actually a good presence on screen. And to be honest, when they all sat together and whenever music was playing, even though I'm not a huge fan of Timothée's rendition of Bob Dylan's voice, I actually thought that's when the movie really worked, is that the actual appreciation of these iconic songs. Every one of these biopics, you're just reminded how many great songs these artists do have. But it sort of lacks in the sense that this is just a biopic. This is like Walk the Line, but you don't have that central chemistry between Joaquin Phoenix and Reese Witherspoon. You sort of lack that because Timothée's doing his very concerted effort to be Bob Dylan, but failing, missing the wood for the trees, missing the human behind the sunglasses. And I really think that it also is reflected in the stock character of Sylvie Russo that is played by Elle Fanning, who has nothing to do except do the typical, you need to do better, you need to be the voice of a generation, I'm your miserable first wife or first girlfriend. We had the same in all these films. There's always the miserable first. The Dewey Cox story told it well. The first embittered lover of this character who just gets broken and abused by them and is treated as such. And I believe is only present in the film because she really doesn't provide anything except a push. And the actual person is famously on Bob Dylan's first album cover, which they had to recreate in this film. Anyway, yeah, so those are just some of my thoughts. It's quite a hard movie to talk about in great depth because it's absolutely fine. I think people will enjoy it, but it has some humor. It has some good performances, but it's nowhere near, I don't think it's even on the same conversation as Walk the Line, let alone any of the more interesting biopics we've had more recently. But Yeah, so it is quite hard to say more about it.
No, but you're right, because so much of, I think, the way that I watched this was informed by the fact that I'm familiar with the genre of musical biopics. And I do think that there's truth in the idea that if you're going to tell an extraordinary musician's life story, you probably should do it in a more unconventional way than this. If you look at something like Rocket Man, which is, a completely kind of hallucinatory, psychedelic trip with all singing, all dancing, proper musical sequences throughout, or indeed the Robbie Williams biopic that's just come out, in which he is portrayed as a chimpanzee. That, I think, is a more interesting way of telling the Bob Dylan story. And of course, we kind of have that because we have the Todd Haynes film "I'm Not There," which I haven't seen, but I understand that tells the story of Bob Dylan, sort of essentially through metaphor and via like 10 different actors playing essentially the role of Bob Dylan. So it's really, I think, just a bit frustrating to watch A Complete Unknown and think, yeah, there's a lot of good to be said about this film, but the overall product is less than the sum of its parts. I didn't at any point in this feel that the soul of Bob Dylan was anywhere near Timothée Chalamet. I think that's such a missed opportunity because he's a brilliant actor. He's really, really brilliant. James Mangold is great, and they could have made a much, much more interesting Bob Dylan biopic than this because he's a fascinating guy. It's a fascinating story. It's a shame to tell it in such a perfunctory way.
I think there's something to be said about how they chose to present it because they were really fixating on the going electric part of the Bob Dylan story, which is really quite early in his career, like 2 or 3 years after his very first album. But I think it's interesting that they still chose to do the very beginnings. And I think the film would have done better if you just focused on the going electric part and really developed these characters and not had to shoehorn in the creation of the Bob Dylan myth, which is skirted over very casually in a way. Like a lot of these things are, you see him write a little bit, write his lyrics, but you don't really understand why he writes his songs. And Bob Dylan is a mystery. And I think what the Todd Haynes film does better is that it separates it. A human being is not just a series of events, they're a series of emotions. And a lot of times in these types of biopics, you get away with it because the songs tell the emotion. But we're so attached to these songs already. They're so ingrained in the lexicon that it's shorthand. It's kind of cheating. You are forced into it because you're like, oh my gosh, Blowing in the Wind, that's a song that resonates with me, or The Times Are Changing, or Mr. Tambourine Man, all these amazing pieces of music. And, okay, fair dues to this film. I went back to listen to more Dylan after it because I'm like, I actually want to hear what the guy sounds like, but also really resonate with these amazing lyrics more than anything else. I find that such an interesting thing. You need to actually, going forward, Rocket Man was a really good examination of what Elton John is as a person. But then when it came to actually talking about the severity, his closetedness and all this stuff, it took it very seriously. And therefore, the juxtaposition really accentuated that point. Another great biopic, I always talk about this when talking about it, Love and Mercy, the Brian Wilson biopic, took two key moments of his life and explored them thoroughly with two different actors. One who was doing a very good rendition of what Brian Wilson was like. Paul Dano's is very accurate, but very emotional as well. But John Cusack's is far more, it's just an actor performing as a character, as a human being, not necessarily recreating Brian Wilson to a T, but doing a wonderful job of representing what and who he is. And that's the thing that I think they were so concerned with the aesthetic and the vocal presentation of Bob Dylan that they didn't actually get the point that these films, this is a human being you're dealing with. Even though they are mystical and mythic and mysterious, you have to peel back those layers. And you're right, it just presented Bob Dylan as an arsehole. It didn't even capture the genius angle of it very spectacularly because it's so rushed, because you're trying to fit in so much. I think if you want to redo this film, you just focus on that one festival, film it over the day, figure out what Bob Dylan's feeling, why he wants to change, why he wants to go against these people. Because if the times are changing for Bob Dylan, we want to really understand why. But this film, it's a bit of a fart blowing in the wind. It won't last long. People will forget about it. They'll say, oh, yeah, Timothée, he did his performance, and then he's going to go on to great things, as I know he will. But it's a big no-go for me, this film.
Yeah, I do agree. And for my money, I think that if you want to see a film about Bob Dylan being a weird genius and kind of, getting a bit of insight into his brain, then I really recommend that you check out the film on Netflix. It's called The Greatest Night in Pop. And it's about the recording of We Are the World. And the stuff with Dylan in that is absolutely fascinating because he's such a weirdo. He's so out of place, he's so stressed out. The world's greatest singers are all there collaborating on this song, and he does not know what his place in it is. And he's vulnerable, and he's brilliant, and he's interesting, and his friendship with Stevie Wonder is incredible. Like, Stevie Wonder sings to him his own part in the style of Bob Dylan. Like, it's really brilliant, and it's really fascinating. And I wish that A Complete Unknown had captured an ounce of that magic. But for me, I completely agree with you. A Fart Blowing in the Wind is brilliant. And it's that silhouette, I think, that the film keeps giving us, keeps coming back to. It's iconic. It's recognizable as Bob Dylan. But there's no detail, and we have no sense of who the man himself is. Now we come to our second film, which is, of course, the new Universal monster movie, The Wolfman. Not to be confused with the 1941 Universal monster movie, The Wolfman. Now, this is helmed by Leigh Whannell, the creator of Saw, co-creator of the Conjuring franchise, and, of course, gave us the brilliant, I think, reinvention of The Invisible Man some years ago. Now, Jake went to the cinema for us and gave this a whirl, and I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say about it, Jake. Does it live up to the brilliance of The Invisible Man?
I think it's interesting. This film approaches the mythic cinematic story of the Universal monsters in a very similar way. Obviously, The Invisible Man redirects the story to be about domestic violence and does it expertly. I also agree. I think it's such a wonderful reinvention from a bloated carcass that was the idea of the dark universe, a misplaced, mismanaged idea that crashed and burned from the very first movie, the Tom Cruise Mummy. However, their reinvention to create these much smaller, cheaper, far more contained movies, I believe, as a filmmaker who delves into horror more readily than others, I think it's a really good approach. And I think The Invisible Man did it really well because it had a lot to say. It had some great performances. And this film sort of begins in a different way. My main issue with this film is I thought it was good. I thought it was very enjoyable, watchable. I wasn't terrified at all, but I've subjected myself to some terrible and very scary horror movies. So I think my poor brain had been desensitized. But I didn't find it scary, but I thought it was quite nicely atmospheric, especially in the opening of the film. It has a beautiful landscape shots of the Oregon forests where it's based, and it does that very, very well. So it takes the rather bloated mythos of the Wolfman. With this film, I thought it had some very good things going for it. I thought they're making it a very personal story. They make it about a very small family. My producer even said about the film that it's about generational trauma. I also think it has some aspects similar to The Invisible Man of about domestic, not in the same level of domestic abuse, but sort of domestic disturbance, the inherited anger and of different generations and how people deal with that. It treats the idea of wolf men and the changing as very internally related to masculinity. Only the men turn into wolves, wolf men, as the movie dictates in its title. But also it's treated as sort of a sickness and illness. And therefore, I think that's a very strong thing about the film, is that the actual transformation of one of the central characters, it's in the trailer, the father of the family, he gets infected. It's a really interesting scope of loss and people coming to terms with degenerative illness as well. It has a lot of really nice moments there, especially between him and his daughter. I think Christopher Abbott, who plays Blake, the lead character, has a really well-established relationship with his daughter very early on in the film. I found that was really nice. I actually think that young actress, she was really good in the film, sort of captured some of those nice moments, especially with him, really nicely. And then the film actually takes sort of stance about how you have to step up as a mother as well. So it's a Very interesting take on that. However, the film is also probably a bit too long, even though it's not the longest film in the world. I think it's too long for how much it actually really has to say. I came out of it thinking, wow, that would have been an amazing short film if it had been, what, 40 minutes long and they'd done a very similar thing, because it's like a trapped in a cabin story. It takes place over one night. It's a very small scale. Yeah, this somewhat supernatural thing occurs of people turning quite grotesquely into beasts, but it's treated in such a way that it is very small and contained. And so I really think that it was a bit too long.
It's interesting because the Wolfman transformation process is so legendary from the 1941 film. You know, there are lots of kind of rumors and stories about how long it took for Lon Chaney to get into the makeup and get out of it and all of that kind of thing. And, you know, there are also sort of apocryphal stories about people being, you know, really terrified by that sequence in the film. Do you feel that the kind of the redesign of the Wolfman works in this film? Because I think there is a danger in the 21st century of it coming off a bit goofy.
Now, it's funny you say that. There is some murmurings that people don't really like the redesign that they actually go with. Leigh Whannell also said, I read up that he made a comment that he was certain some people won't like it, but he thinks it works for this film. I will agree with him. I think that the redesign of the Wolfman goes to a point where it has canine-like attributes, but you see very clearly the transition from human to man. And this isn't a werewolf, it's a wolfman. So you still want to draw the line between the two. It's obviously not a patch on the amazing transformation in An American Werewolf in London, which is the gold standard, but the actual transition, the sort of the crossing the line between the two is kind of subtle. The makeup job is really effective, I think, because it's a slow transition, and then there's a more intense one a bit later in the film when the humanity is all but lost. I think some people may look at it and be like, well, that's a man being a dog. It's kind of goofy, but it's a film about someone, the wolf man. It's about a man turning into a wolf. So I think if people are up in arms about it, I think that might be a bit, you're watching the wrong film, to be honest. But I think it is interesting to say that, you know, how do you tell these stories again? Because we've had a Dracula story in the last couple of weeks, a reimagining that some people thought was incredibly effective. We thought the complete opposite, that it was absolutely missed opportunity, and a complete redesign of Dracula as well. Obviously as Count Orlok, but now we've had a redesign of the Wolfman. I think the Invisible Man was most effective because it really modernized the story.
Yeah.
And this doesn't really do that. It just creates a very nice atmosphere. I thought a lot of the choices of cinematography were really good too, but there was a lot missing as well. Like, it wasn't as hefty as I think it could have been if they really just went with the family angle. It sort of really sort of falls off by the third act. Yeah, that it's hard to talk about much more because it is a really nice attempt. I think it's a really good approach to take these Universal monster movies in this way. But I think they need to figure out what really worked in The Invisible Man more than just trying these things without as much depth as it really brought in that film. I'd love to see where they would take something like Frankenstein, or maybe, I guess we had The Shape of Water, which was a really interesting retelling of a Creature of the Black Lagoon type story. But it'd be really interesting to see how to modernize it a bit more, because this film was sort of stuck in the sort of 80s and 90s, really, because they sort of go back to a family home that was stuck in that period of time. So it didn't really modernize the Wolfman story in the way, but I guess modern attitudes of how it was approached. So I would recommend it. I'd say it's a decent watch, but I don't think you'll be quaking in your boots or howling at the moon per se for this film. But yeah, it's a decent watch, but it's not a patch on The Invisible Man. But I'd love to see if they keep doing this type of thing. Hopefully it's successful so they can, and where they go next with these monster movies. Now we move on to our next film, a hidden gem, perhaps, or maybe a lump of coal in the dirt. William Tell, directed by Nick Ham. Now, Reuben went to see this because you had an advanced screening or a screening that you could watch and engage with, which is really interesting because I think this film is nowhere to be seen. It's like the myth of William Tell. It's sort of in the air, but you can't really knuckle it down. But yeah, I'd love to know about the film. Tell us whether it's successful, whether it should get a wider release, whether people should flock to the cinema to see it, Reuben, as you did go and see it. So please tell us about William Tell and your thoughts.
So it's interesting. I mean, this, as you say, it has got a release, but it's not a huge one. It's not on that many screens. And to be honest, the place to see this is in the cinema because it's a big, bloody action historical epic. You know, this is sort of gladiator territory, although, you know, on a significantly smaller budget. It basically is a retelling of the folk tale of William Tell, which I have to say I'm not familiar with, but it is basically a kind of Robin Hood-esque story about a man who stands up to authority, is very skilled with a bow, and ultimately leads a rebellion. And in this film, the central character of William Tell is played by Claes. I think is really good here. He gives completely a sense of Shakespearean grandeur to the role of William Tell. I was watching this thinking, gosh, I want to be seeing him perform Macbeth on the stage because he's got such gravitas, and it's something about the way that, you know, he has those slightly vampiric teeth and things. There's a sinisterness to him, there's a menace that means that even though he's playing a heroic figure here, we get the sense of demons lurking underneath. And basically, he finds himself in a situation where, for the protection of his family, for the protection of the community that he cares about, he ends up becoming a kind of unwitting figurehead for rebellion, which makes him the target of Connor Swindells from Sex Education. Sinister baddie, essentially. I'm just going to call him a baddie, who then is hunting down William Tell. And I have to say, Connor Swindells is having the time of his life in this film. There is no bit of scenery unchewed. He's scoffing the lot. Everything is delivered in this kind of very broad, just generally sort of ne'er-do-well manner that I just really enjoyed. He's frequently hacking limbs off innocent people or ordering the deaths of children, and he's doing it all with relish. And that's basically kind of the tone of this film. It's two steps away from Panto, if only there was a lot more blood and gore when you go and see Mother Goose. I can't say I wasn't entertained by it. It delivers really good big screen spectacle. You know, I kind of mentioned Gladiator, and, you know, actually, I was really impressed by the action sequences in this. They're very crunchy. You get a real sense of like, oh, that's a bit, oh gosh, what am I seeing? At times, which is always a sign that something's got me. The fact is, I sort of knew that this story was going to follow a set narrative because this is a kind of piece of mythos that exists in the world. You know, I enjoyed it. I was never bored. I think that it could lose a solid 20 minutes, but to be honest, most of those scenes that you'd be cutting are pretty entertaining sequences. You know, you've got a great cast in there, and I'd hate to lose any of them. Jonathan Pryce, Sir Ben Kingsley, they're all popping up left, right, and centre. And I thought that it also had actually quite a good score by Stephen Price. I think it's very difficult when you've got, obviously, the overture of William Tell, so iconic and associated with that character. Quite difficult to write a good, rousing piece of music, but he delivered. So, yeah, I enjoyed it. It was quite good. I wish it had been maybe slightly shorter. But yeah, overall, it was fine.
That's interesting to hear you say that. I'd seen in my little cinema app, oh, what's this film? I've never seen a trailer, never heard it was coming out. And, you know, big actors are there. And Claes Bangs, he's up and coming. You know, he was in The Northman as well, you know, Robert Eggers' previous film too.
Masterpiece. A masterpiece.
I won't. The Northman, the North superhero. But yes, I find it interesting that I wanted to say is, from your point of view, these folkloric stories, similar to Robin Hood, that get these massive remakes, and William Tell, this might be the most recent of its big screen adaptations, but do you think it still has a place in modern cinema where it seems that every reiteration of Batman, Spider-Man, they get billions and billions of dollars, but stuff like Robin Hood, the most recent one with Taron Egerton, failed miserably, and this idea of William Tell that doesn't even get a wide marketing campaign in this country where it is released, where it is on screens. Why do you think that is? And do you think that the film actually earns itself a better respect, or is it just falling into blockbuster schlock and that's why it's losing off? What's your sort of opinion of that?
That's such a good question because it's true that we haven't really seen many of these kind of big budget movies that are engaging with these kind of traditional myths and legends be very successful really last 20 years. I think Robin Hood, the Taranation version, is actually a good sort of comparison because this actually takes a slightly similar approach to some of the kind of the action on screen because that very much was, I mean, it was basically like they were lobbing grenades at times. And in this, there is definitely a kind of sense of, okay, in this sequence, the crossbows are basically rifles. There is definitely a kind of attempt to modernize things a bit. But I think the strength of this is that actually it hews quite close to, I think, the original material. It hews quite close to the traditional narrative. And it presents it in a fairly conventional way. And I don't mean conventional as a criticism. There is a lot of good to be said about kind of old-fashioned filmmaking. And this, I think, slots very neatly into it. It's not swords and sandals, but it's almost there, kind of fun, feel fairly good, epic. And I think that if we can get another really big hit out of that genre, it might well be revitalized. I think someone has to come along and work out perhaps what the key to those stories is and what makes them tick. A bit like with something like The Wolfman. I think if we have a slightly revised approach to, okay, what's this actually about thematically? Like, what are we saying? What does this mean in the 21st century? We might be able to kind of see this genre of film get a new lease of life. But at the moment, it's perfectly okay. I mean, as I said at the beginning, you should see this at the cinema if you're going to, because the visuals are very good and the action is crunchier if you're watching it with a really good sound system. But at the end of the day, are many people going to see this? I don't think that they are. And that's not just because the release isn't that big, it's also because these movies just are not in vogue anymore. And that's a shame, but it happens, and I think that they will come back.
On January the 15th, last week, David Lynch passed away, and we thought that it would just be appropriate as filmmakers ourselves, as film lovers, to take a moment to sit down and talk about him and talk about his work and specific things that affected us as creatives and just the overall legacy of a really great artistic mind, a really powerful presence in just sort of inner but outer Hollywood, sort of living between moments and between worlds. I think David Lynch was a visionary, an artist, a filmmaker, a poet, and a crazy guy, but in all the best ways, I think. So, Reuben, please start us off.
So it's interesting because I think the first time I sort of knew who David Lynch was, I think I was probably about 14 and I was watching television late at night. I was just sort of awake at 1 in the morning and like I think my brother was asleep on the sofa. And the Elephant Man came on. And I just remember immediately being so enraptured by it and so intrigued by it. And by the end of the film, he'd woken up. We were both watching it, and it was just brilliant. And it was such phenomenally kind of moving and exciting filmmaking at the same time. The genius of David Lynch shone through. And I've just loved him ever since, and and seen more of his films and learned more about his character. And it feels like such a tremendous loss for for art, honestly, because as you say, he was a painter. He was a musician sometimes. He made strange videos on YouTube. I don't know if you followed him on YouTube, but every single day during the pandemic, he would get a collection of ping pong balls with numbers written on them, put them in a glass jar, fumble around in the jar without looking at them, and then show the camera a ball and say, the number is 5. And then the video would end. And he did that every single day, and it was completely surreal. It was so Lynch. It was completely surreal, but it was also kind of fascinating and weirdly gripping. And the internet sort of became really like, what's going to happen, really gripped by it, because he never picked out the number seven. And I think the fact that David Lynch managed to make picking a ball out of a jar every single day during a pandemic interesting and like genuinely like performance art just says everything about him as a character. And I loved his hair, and I loved his coffee drinking, and I loved his weather forecasts. He was just brilliant and fascinating, and a true artist, and by all accounts, a really good, kind person who had no time for the nonsense that often happens on Hollywood sets. So I think that it's a loss for cinema. It's a loss, for humanity, and it's a loss for me. So I'm very sad. I haven't been able to go and watch one of his films because I don't know which one it should be. I don't know what would be the right one to kind of honour his death. But tell me about your feelings and your relationship with David Lynch films. Did you watch a film when you heard that he had died?
No, similarly to you, Reuben, I haven't found the right one to sit down and watch. Perhaps Eraserhead, but also perhaps uh, maybe one of his later works. I know that his work connected me and my dad quite a lot in the sense that we sat down and watched the 80s Dune, which my dad, I know David Lynch famously hates it, but my dad adored and still adores the film. He loves the Villeneuve ones, but he really did grow up loving the film. And it was great to see because I think that film is not as flawed as people think. I think it is an 80s oddity. And I love those really crazy. I would have loved to see what the version would have been if David Lynch had complete control over that film. Me and my dad also sat down and watched Twin Peaks together the first time I watched it. And I remember we watched the pilot twice. We sort of started at one point years before we actually continued to watch the whole series. But just seeing it twice with him and just being engaging with such masterwork, I think the Twin Peaks pilot is one of the greatest pieces of television ever put to celluloid. I think that he is just such a sincere artist, and I think that's what people sometimes forget is they love the aesthetic, they love Lynchian aesthetic, but they don't understand why it works. Is that to David Lynch, it's just, I heard someone make a comment when I was looking through, because I've been watching a lot of videos. I was watching interviews the day before he died as well. It was kind of sadly prophetic, and interviews about his works, because I find him most inspiring. But it's because he finds the beauty of great pie and great coffee and kind characters like Dale Cooper, or madly in love characters like Nick Cage and Laura Dern in Wild at Heart, that it's as sincere as he approaches the surrealist angles. They're all on the same level of reality as a filmmaker. It's not treated as trying to be bizarre. It's not treated as trying to be saccharine. It's treated as just plain and simple. And I think what I wanted to talk about was my sort of favorite bit of David Lynch filmmaking. And it's very simple. It's from episode 1 of series 2 of Twin Peaks. It's a great moment in the famous diner that the character of Bobby Briggs and his father are sat down at a table. And it's not very cinematically, it's just shot, reverse shot, and then a 2-shot later in the scene. It doesn't explore any wild lighting, it doesn't explore any wild set design, but what it does do is it captures character brilliantly. And that's what people sometimes avoid when they're trying to create this Lynchian aesthetic for themselves, is that actually it's all about the character and how human they really are. It's a really beautiful scene. It starts with the father telling his son, and they do not have a good relationship. They are very separate from one another. But the father starts telling his son about a dream. And it's and David Lynch, you could say all his films are dreamlike, but the sort of description, the descriptors of this dream are so beautiful and so intricate, very, very well thought out. But you just see that the actual reason of all this dialogue is that the father is confessing to his son his true emotions to him. And you see on the character of Bobby's face of just the realization of that. And that's such mature directing, because it is a roundabout way to say, oh, I'm proud of you, son, and I love you. But it is so delicate. It's built up, it's earned, it's deserved. And when the general shakes the hands with his son and says, "I'm proud of you, and I'm so happy to see that you have become this man." It shatters you. It shatters you, and it's such a random scene. It just shows up in the episode. It doesn't add to the plot. It doesn't change anything. It is just, but it affects the whole series from then on. The idea of filmmaking is that actually it's all about an emotional arc or an understanding, a very acute understanding of humanity in general. And I think and it's what I harp on about in Cinema Spotlight all the time, is the character and the actual understanding of human beings, which is so often overlooked to create a good film. And it's such an integral part. And I think you're going to miss that because no one can capture it quite the same, because these characters can do the most bizarre thing in the world, and yet it's right for them. It makes sense for them completely and wholly. I don't think there's a single David Lynch character in any of his works that isn't fully realized in David Lynch's head and in the performer's head. He had such a tightly knit group of people who loved working for him and who were often repeated, and so perfectly because they understood it. Harry Dean Stanton, for example, is a great example. Great friends with him, a brilliant actor, or Emmett McGill, who is in both Dune and Twin Peaks, and of course the amazing Carl McLachlan, who I read his tribute to David Lynch, absolutely beautiful, about how they sort of crafted one another. It was incredible. So I know I've been harping on a lot, but a director, my absolute favorite, and will be sincerely missed. And we have been robbed of any future greatness, but we have a lot of greatness to look back on.
It's true, and I would like to leave you, Jake, with a fact that you might know, but you might not, and I know that you'll appreciate it, which is, of course, that he was the inspiration for Peter Capaldi's costume as the 12th Doctor. Did you know that?
No, I didn't. That's amazing. But now it makes perfect sense, especially Series 9 hair, and you've got it. Amazing.
I mean, yeah, as you say, he was a true titan, one of the greatest, filmmakers I think I've ever seen working. So I feel very lucky, in many ways to have watched his films and to have been around at the same time as him. And yeah, it's a real sad day for cinema lovers. But exactly as you say, so much great stuff that we already have. So yes, rest in peace, David Lynch.
So, Reuben, what was your best of the week?
Yes, well, it's a slightly tricky week because both of the films that I saw, I was a bit lukewarm on. I think that if you go and see the Bob Dylan film, A Complete Unknown, you'll have a perfectly okay time. But to be honest, because it's not in a lot of cinemas and it's not necessarily a particularly trendy film, I'd sort of encourage people to go and watch William Tell because it's an interesting film and it's very well made. It's got some decent performances in there, and it's a really interesting kind of cinematic curio, I would say. So go and see William Tell on the big screen so that you can enjoy Claes Bang disemboweling people. How about you, Jake? What would you say is your film of the week?
Well, you're right. This week, all the films were pretty mid, I think, or at least the ones I watched were. And so, again, mate, I know the masses will go see Bob Dylan. They'll go see Timothée Chalamet's impression of Bob Dylan. However, I'd recommend people watch Lost Highway by David Lynch. I think a really interesting film that gets slept on a lot. Probably one of my, if not my favorite of his films. I think people should really watch that. But if they want something weird but fun, also watch Wild at Heart, two of my absolute favorites. But I guess I would recommend The Wolfman, as I said, from the films that we watched, the newer films we watched this week. But it might not leave you fully satisfied, so you might need to pair it the Leigh Whannell's Invisible Man as well to give a bit more of a rounded experience.
And that brings us to the end of this week's episode of Cinema Spotlight. It's been lovely having you.
Next week, we'll be talking about The Brutalist, Flight Risk, and Presence.
We look forward to seeing you then. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.